Welcome to the Thinklings podcast, a conversation where good thoughts help renew the mind with the Word of God. I'm Charlie Carter, and I'm here with Tim Little and Andy Stearns. Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome to the Thinklings podcast, and in this episode, which, is this the first episode of the year?
This is it. Happy New Year, everybody.
It is. Yeah.
This is a new year.
2023. Which is, and as Andy frantically motions for Tim to start the clock.
It's going.
Gone. Okay.
The poor listeners if we don't start our timer.
Yeah, that was a New Year's resolution. Always start the timer.
You're horrendous.
So here's what we're going to do in this episode. So in this season 6, we are going to take 4 episodes and walk through the 4 loves by C.S. Lewis. So before we do that, we're going to have an episode, which is this episode, where we talk about why would you read C.S. Lewis in the first place? Like, why is he valuable to read? Maybe what are some problems you might have to think through, or considerations like why would you read C.S. Lewis? Why would you read through the 4 loves? What value is there? So I think what we're going to do to start is we're going to go around and we're going to share our favorite C.S. Lewis book or work, and maybe why. And Tim's, I think, looking for some quote action too. So is that what we're doing?
I think so. Do you want me to do a quick biography? Like a 5-minute biography
throw a little,
for our listeners? We could do that.
Give us some bio information.
So listeners, C.S. Lewis is an Anglican from England. He was born in like 1903 or 1908, one of those 2 dates. And so he grew up in Belfast, Ireland. And at 8 years old, he went off to boarding school, which was very average to normal at that time period. His mother will end up dying of cancer, I believe, when he's either 9, 10, or 11. It's pretty young. And he loved his mother, didn't really get along well with his dad. It wasn't that they fought a lot. His dad was just kind of a fakey salesman, lawyer kind of guy. And Lewis never felt like he could just be himself. He always had to say just the right thing. And so in the midst of this kind of crisis of losing his mom and being at boarding school, which is horrid, he walks away from Christianity and he ends up getting confirmed in the Anglican Church. I believe he's 18. No, I think that's Richard Dawkins, who was confirmed 18 and he was an atheist. But I think Lewis, it's very similar. He said he took the communion, his first communion, maybe it is, even though he knew he was an atheist because he didn't want to upset his dad. And from that point on, he kind of walks away. He goes to school. He lives as an atheist. He gets conscripted to go to World War I. And he makes a treaty with reality where he says, fine, I'll go serve my country. I'll give him my blood, maybe even my life. But I won't give him that a day sooner. And so 9 months later, he's set to ship out. So he doesn't read any news on World War I. He goes to World War I, and it's pretty gruesome. He gets injured at one point, goes home. And after that, he's going to go to Oxford, which he wasn't able to make it in before World War I because he wasn't good at math. But after World War I, so many guys died that they need students and they let him in. And so he studies there. He's a great, very intellectual guy, ends up teaching there and ends up meeting another guy who would be an author one day.
Owen Barfield.
Yeah. And so those two, well, I think him, and then he also met another guy, Charlie, who's the other guy?
Charles Williams.
Yeah. And then he met a third guy.
Hugo Dyson.
Oh, come on. Get to Tolkien.
J.R.R. Tolkien.
Charlie knows quite a bit about the Inklings. And so anyways, all of these guys end up functioning to challenge his atheism. And I believe, was it Tolkien or was it Barfield? I thought it was Tolkien that he credited.
It depends who you talk to.
Okay.
I think probably Tolkien is one of the more profound conversations that they had along the Addison Way.
I remember that one.
That was a very profound conversation with Tolkien, but I think as far as like a steady friend who's been challenging him for years, Barfield would fill that role as well.
And Tolkien, essentially, Lewis becomes a convert to Christianity again. And Tolkien is actually kind of saddened because he doesn't become a Catholic, he becomes an Anglican. And that's a little bit, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that was kind of a sore spot for a little while between them. It's not like they didn't talk, but Tolkien was a little hurt. So Lewis will have he's an academic, he teaches for a long time and he writes books. He does a number of talks on the radio called the Broadcast Talks, and those talks end up becoming the book Mere Christianity. He does some apologetic stuff in that book and some others. Then he begins to write fiction works and other essays, and eventually he dies on the same day that John F. Kennedy is assassinated. And so his name does not hit the news because Kennedy's assassination obviously outshines him, but it's the same day. So that's the life of C.S. Lewis. He was an Anglican his whole life, although at the end, I think we would say he was almost like a Catholic kind of an Anglican. He's on that side of the Anglican Church.
Catholic-like practices at the end of his life. So
now let's talk favorite books. Tim, do you have a favorite C.S. Lewis book that you enjoy? And listener, we're going to get to why we would read this guy, so hang with us.
I think I'm going to pick Screwtape Letters.
Ooh.
I was vacillating between a few. I don't have a Lewis book that really kind of shines bright over all of the others. But I think Screwtape Letters, I like how he just depicts the demons and how the world, the flesh, and the devil seek to lead people away from the Lord. So that was the book that I decided to go with, was Screwtape Letters for my favorite C.S. Lewis book. Interesting thing, I've only read it once, but yeah, I like it.
I'm going to pick a fiction title of his, That Hideous Strength. I just love that book. I like it because he depicts the ideas of another essay that he writes. And I like the way he develops characters. I like the story. I like that you have a modern versus postmodernism going on, and you have the pre-modern thought going on in there too. Actually, it's more like pre-modern versus modern, sorry. I really enjoyed it. It's a great story, but not everyone enjoys it. It's not everybody's cup of tea. Although I think I owe you a bag of coffee, Charlie, if you've read it 3 times since season 1. Because I think we made that wager back in the day. So I really like that one, and that's what I would say is probably my favorite. But I was almost going to pick Screwtape Letters, Tim.
Really?
Yeah, that was my first real C.S. Lewis read.
Oh.
Like full through.
I don't think I've read it 3 times. I've certainly listened to it, but not read. So
I love it.
And those are 2 different actions.
I know, we don't need to go through it again.
So,
listener, never mind. It was
first episode of the year.
Keep going.
We got one punch in, one at a time. I don't know what I would say. It's so hard to pick one.
I
really
figured
is.
you'd have one.
What do you
Surprised by
think?
Joy?
What do you think? Surprised by Joy? No, it's definitely not that.
That's my favorite. That would be my favorite nonfiction title. I love Surprised by Joy.
I'm trying to think like things that I've mentioned.
He probably wants to pick a series like The Chronicles of Narnia.
No, if I was going to pick something from The Chronicles of Narnia, I think there'd be like you'd pick a book. I think the thing that I've referenced the most is probably The Abolition of Man.
Yeah, that one was the one I was thinking of considering just because it's the one I've read and worked through and taught the most. But it's kind of hard to wade through.
But we're not playing the game of what's the most helpful.
Right.
We're playing the game of which one do I like the most.
Yeah, whatever that means.
And I would say probably, I think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is in its own realm. Like like a story. Like I feel like that's like the easy pick. And so if I was going to pick something from Narnia, I think it would be The Horse and His Boy.
Oh, that's so
probably
good.
my favorite of
That's
the
so
others.
good.
But of the space trilogy, I just love that first book. I don't know why, Out of the Silent Planet.
I can't believe you 2 guys are picking 2 books out of the space
They're so
trilogy.
good.
No, they're not.
Well,
The Fifthful Triggy and the Sorns and the
I think that-
Now.
All you had to do is say all of those names, and then it illustrates why it's not that good.
Yeah, I think if you bring some of the other aspects into it, maybe one of the more meaningful books is probably The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yeah.
So like I didn't grow up like knowing who Lewis was. I didn't grow up like I think most Christians, either it was like his name was a curse word or like you had it all, like, and so like I think a lot of Christians that I've interacted with read Narnia as kids or had it read to them. I never had that experience. I didn't even know that it was in existence. And I came to college, and obviously everyone at the Bible college is well aware of who C.S. Lewis is. And I really didn't interact with C.S. Lewis at all until I can remember watching one of the movies that came out. I can remember where I was when I watched it. It was a Mexican restaurant, and a TV in the corner of the Mexican restaurant was playing I think it was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the film that came out.
Wow.
And like the newer film. And and I was like, what's that? And that's kind of, that's whatever. And you're like, like that. So that's where you learn about it. But it really wasn't until seminary I took a class exploring C.S. Lewis taught by Andy, where I was forced to read a lot of his stuff. And I didn't come into it like, C.S. Lewis, because I didn't really know who he was. I kind of knew who he was. But I think from that, that's where I read The Abolition of Man for the first time, and like had no idea what I was reading. And you just, but
like everybody who reads that the first time.
yeah, it takes a handful of iterations. But so I think, but then once you kind of understand who he is, and we read his biography by McGrath, and you kind of realize who this guy is and how influential and important this guy is. And you read Mere Christianity, and you're like, oh, he's a really good thinker. But then I still don't think I can ever replace, as far as just affection, when you read through The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you've never interacted with it before, and you get to the point where Aslan is killed by the witch, and the two girls are crying, but then the sun comes up and he raises from the dead. And there's no, like, you can't miss that.
I got goosebumps.
Like as a Christian, like obviously it's a children's book. It's meant to be low hanging fruit, but you just can't. The way that stirred me the first time I read it, I'd probably have to pick that. But I feel like that's the sexy pick, like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You got to pick that one. And
Why?
So if you take that one off the shelf for a moment, I would probably either pick Out of the Silent Planet, Horse and His Boy, or Abolition of Man. So a very long, convoluted answer.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got to go revise mine. So if I had to pick a nonfiction and a fiction.
Oh, okay. Well, if we do that,
the nonfiction is Surprised by Joy, hands down. But if I had to pick a Narnia, I think it's The Silver Chair now.
Yeah, I thought you were saying
really
that.
That's my
Silver
new
Chair.
one. Like, I didn't like that the first time I read it, but I recently read it, and man, the ontological argument and Puddleglum, but then the nonfiction has to be, or the fiction has to be out of sight, or That Hideous Strength for me. So
yeah, I really like Silver Chair too, because Puddleglum as a character is one of my favorite characters.
I know, and now he teaches here. It's great.
That Hideous Strength is fiction.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I mixed those up. Sorry.
Yeah. And then there's, what's funny is probably my favorite of the space trilogies, Out of the Silent Planet. Andy's favorite is That Hideous Strength, and your favorite would probably be Paralandra, right?
Yeah, I like Paralandra.
See, and that's
a great one too.
That's why we're so good as a podcast, because we all like a different space trilogy.
I don't know how much I like it, but of all of them, I like Paralandra the best.
It is really good. They're all good.
Okay, so let's get into a discussion of why would someone read C.S. Lewis? What is the benefit? Positives.
Lewis helps you think. So that's why, as Thinklings, we really strongly encourage you to think and think better. Lewis is going to push you in that direction where you're going to have to really think. A lot of times when I'm recommending a reading group or telling somebody, hey, you should get together with a group of friends and read a book, a Lewis book's a great book to read because you can read a little bit of it and then you can kind of ask, what is he saying here? And you'll have to think about it. I recommend Abolition of Man as one of those kinds of books. And Four Loves is actually a great book to read through as a group because it's talking about like that friendship component of love. And sometimes you're going to read through and it's like, what in the world is he saying here? And sometimes even after reading him a few times, I still ask myself that question, what is he saying here? And sometimes I'm like, I don't really care. And then I just keep going. But at least it pushes you to think. And that's one of the benefits of Lewis.
I think probably the first thing that drew me into him, and I don't think I would have said this at the time, looking back, I think the issue is, it is thinking, but it's clarity. So I know that sounds weird because some of his stuff is convoluted, but when he sees something and he's so perceptive and he points it out, usually the light bulb goes on for me because he clarified something. So the classic example for me is I'm reading Mere Christianity for the first time. And I have some problems with Lewis, which we'll talk about later, which this book actually has some. But one of the great things was he lays out this moral argument for God's existence. And in it, he's talking about this, that everyone knows there's like a moral law. And he says, let's say you and your friend are sharing an orange and you're splitting it, and your friend splits it in half and gives you the small half. And you look at him and you say, hey, that's not fair. And I thought in my mind, first time I read that, oh, that's it. You know there's fairness, and that's his point. And it wasn't. He says, it's not that you know fairness exists and it's a moral law, or it's like a moral rule. It's that you know it, and without ever talking to that other person, you expect they know it too. And that to me was like the mind-blown moment where, oh, he's really seeing something that is true, but I hadn't noticed it. And he does the same thing in a lot of his other books. So like right now I'm working through Four Loves when we're recording this for next semester, or for the next couple of weeks for you, listener. And he's talking about one of the aspects of love that made me look back and understand how a former friendship I had sort of fallen apart. And what he was talking about in this one aspect, wow, I'd never noticed it. And it was right there. So I think there's something about him where he notices and observes things, and he's very clear in explaining them. I think that's helpful. I don't know how to see the way he sees. I wished I could see more like he notices. I think that would be helpful. So listener, if you read him, I think there's that part of thinking that's good.
Yeah. So I'm going to piggyback on top of that and say, and we'll get into this in a moment, that he would be thinking in the framework of the pre-modern mind.
Yeah.
And the way that we get into like a pre-modern or a modern or a postmodern, we've talked about that type of stuff a number of times on the podcast. Essentially, what do we mean when we're exalting someone who thinks with a pre-modern mind? Is that they have a worldview that we trust. And we could talk about theological quandaries of Lewis where we wouldn't actually agree with him, and maybe you need to be aware of some of these things as you interact with him. But the way he thinks, the framework of his imagination, of how he views reality and thinks through life in that reality, is very consistent. And I think that's helpful. Tim talked about thinking, and he talked about like thinking really clearly. And I think the benefit is you use Lewis as I don't know what the right word is, maybe a template or a design of how you should approach problems and think them through. You're going to find that he has a very trustworthy and consistent worldview. I think a worldview that you would trust.
Yep.
More often than not, if you apply that template to how you should approach difficulty, you would find a consistent way of working through a philosophical or logical question or problem. And I think that's what is so unique about him, that from within a standpoint of objective truth, and this is a broad term, but within Christianity broadly, as an Anglican who has very Catholic leanings, but still within a dedicated Christian worldview, you can trust the way he thinks about the biggest problems of life. And I think that is a helpful thing.
Yep. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, another helpful thing I was going to say is, listener, his rejecting of Christianity, and then his trying to live life as an atheist and it not working. I think that's another super huge benefit to him. When you read Surprised by Joy, he walks you through how life is unlivable if you are going to say there's no God, especially when he wants to like call God unjust, but he can't say there's a standard of justice if there's no God. He really demonstrates you can't live it. And then he shows what does he call himself? He's like super begrudging when he wants to convert. He doesn't want to become a Christian, but he's like, there's no
reluctant.
He's the reluctant convert. That's like what some people call it. Oh, that's McGrath's subtitle.
Is it really?
Yeah, I think it's a reluctant convert.
Well, then there's the what's it called? Fellowship of Performing Arts. They have the show going around right now.
Yes.
There's actually a
Yep.
film, The Most Reluctant Convert. It's very good, I would say. I think,
Yeah.
did I talk about that on a previous episode?
Did you?
Our film
yeah,
club
yeah.
got the rights to show it on campus, and so we watched it one night, and I thought, and it's an actor, Max McLean, who I think that's how you say his name, who he is playing Lewis as like a first person, as an older Lewis, and walking you through the stages of his younger life and as, how he progressed to understand. And it's fascinating. It's probably not, I wouldn't say like an entry level. Like I would probably try to read Surprised by Joy first and then watch it. Like as always, you read the book first, right? Gotta get those punches in early in the year. Or listen.
I'm joking.
Stop.
I just want to see Tim roll his eyes.
But anyways, I think it's actually done really well. But how did we get on this ball?
I think being a former atheist and then turning back and he's like sort of painted into a corner. He painted himself into a corner and he had to submit. I think that's beneficial.
Yeah.
I think that's beneficial.
Yeah. And I think, I'm kind of surprised Tim didn't already say this, but maybe he will say something about it when I mention it. I think what's so good about Lewis, and this is kind of building off of the worldview and the mind that we trust, he has a very correct view of the affections.
Mm-hmm.
Like as a human, how should I be affected? What should I love? How should I cultivate loves and things like that? And I think he does it really well in his own creative writings, where he's stirring the proper affections for children through Narnia and things like that.
Even Screw Tape Letters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so I think that's another thing that you can really benefit from. Why would you not just read Lewis, but why would you read Lewis's fiction?
Mm-hmm.
Is that it actually, I think Narnia is probably obviously the pinnacle of this, but for getting into the realm of children's literature that is also from a good or much better worldview and has Christian theology, you're not going to find something that cultivates affections that way as well. And there are some like in that discussion maybe, but there's a reason why it's a Christian classic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a young child to read Narnia is going to stir them in a way that you'd want them to be stirred.
Yeah. I think so. I don't know if I'd put it that high, but it's definitely a Christian classic that's going to help cultivate the affections. Yeah. There's been some newer fiction that's been released. Just thinking of like Wingfeather and Green Ember, where and the funny thing is that both of these authors are basically writing with Lewis and what Lewis was trying to do in mind.
Yep.
So they're kind of continuing his heritage. But cultivating the affections, shaping the desires of the next generation so that they want the right things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would. It's hard to compare them one to another, but I just think Lewis develops a story much. I don't think Lewis was like this on his own, but I think it kind of rubbed off on him spending time with Tolkien.
Yeah,
and I just think his world is better. I don't know how to describe that. In both of his worlds, when he gets to Out of the Silent Planet, and he's telling you all these things that are happening, like it's just a good. I don't know. It's just there's a maybe a second layer to it that isn't in those other things. But that's someone I've read and listened through Wingfeather multiple times too, and it definitely stirs your affections well. Accomplishes the same goal. So we've said some good things about why you should read Lewis. What would be some of the negatives or drawbacks to Lewis, or maybe just like asterisks that we might want to be aware of when we read through Lewis?
Lewis is a philosopher, so his writings are helpful for thinking. He's an apologist, so again, it's going to help you with thinking. I don't know if I've ever really seen a verse reference in any of his books. Have you?
He has an essay or a book on the Psalms, and it's pretty bad. So
that's getting to my point, is that he's not a biblicist or an exegete.
Well, and he will mention a Bible verse at the beginning of the Four Loves. He'll get into this like God is
Mhm.
love discussion
Yeah.
from First John. But so this gets back to
Weight of Glory. Sorry, Weight of Glory.
Yeah.
The whole thing is a sermon.
so what in particular about Lewis, how Lewis interacts with Scripture. What might be some like undercurrents to why it's so bad? Do you guys have any thoughts there? I do.
I do.
No, I don't. I just would say that's one of the problems with Lewis. What he says a lot of times is very good. And I'm like, why don't you bring up Job 28 here? Why aren't you bringing up Ecclesiastes here? And the reason is because he's not a biblicist. He's a philosopher and he's an apologist. So that's one of my criticisms. Go ahead, your turn.
He never went to Bible college.
Oh, that's the problem. You need to come to Bible college, listener.
It's actually, I think I could confidently say that a student at Faith has a better Bible knowledge than Lewis did.
Absolutely. Yep.
He was never trained theologically, and he actually admits that fact.
And that's what I was going to say. I wonder if you're going to say the same thing. He says, "I'm not." Where I wish I had the quote on my.
Yeah,
I'm not a theologian, and I'll leave this to the theologians. I only see myself as a novice.
It might be in the Four Loves. I can't remember.
Well, I've read it, and I haven't read the Four Loves, so it.
A simple Google search will do it.
Yeah. But no, I would say
that the listener can look it up.
I would agree. I think that's part of it. Number one, he doesn't see himself as a theologian because he knows he's not trained as a theologian. Not that you, listener, you don't need to be trained. Everyone's a theologian because you have thoughts on God.
Absolutely.
Like, it's just if you're better or not, or worse. And I think Lewis, if you think about it, the arc of his life, he grows up in this state church, sort of quasi-Protestant Catholic denomination known as the Anglican Church. He's not really believing it. Totally rejects it and walks down. I mean, he's dabbling in cults and mysticisms and magic,
a whole bunch of random stuff,
like all that stuff.
Yeah.
And doesn't. I mean, is it Barfield? Who's one of his buddies? He's like, they're like dabbling in some sort of magic, and he leaves it. And then the other guy, is it anthroposophism?
Well, I don't know if that's necessarily.
Maybe we're in the weeds. Maybe I'm in the weeds.
Anthroposophy is a thing that Barfield was with, but like. So you'd think break down the word man, posophy, Sophia, wisdom. So it's like human wisdom, and it's a very similar like philosophical thing. I don't know how
I think I'm thinking
mystical
of
that became,
because he was when he was an atheist. I'm just trying to say, and it's ironic because you see this today. As an atheist, he doesn't just believe in nothing or only science and verificationism. He starts to be drawn to like the pagan arts.
Yeah.
And so then when he gets converted, he's like what, late 30s? And so you're late 30s, you're an English language philologist, and you're not a theologian, you're a philosopher. And so I think he's got 30 years of sort of apologetics ministry, but he doesn't have seminary or college or church training.
So what's interesting is you look at how rational and reasonable he is.
I know.
And you just get the feeling like if he would have just read the epistles and like, well, hey, Clive, what do you think Paul meant when he wrote that? Like read through the New Testament and let's think about the sacraments. You would think that a mind like that would easily conclude that, it's not some like mystical transubstantiation or consubstantiation, but I don't think he ever felt qualified in a church setting to like be dogmatic on it. I think he would have felt I would have to find that quote, but I think he felt inadequate to comment theologically on things. It's like he knew where he was an expert. And he knew that was not the field.
Yeah.
So trust the experts.
Yep.
The problem is when you trust the experts and you're within like the Anglican or Catholic Church, you might have some theological problems there.
Well, and he, in his Psalms, I think it's in the Psalms work, which is escaping me. He denies inerrancy.
Yeah. And that was another thing.
And then the other thing I would say on that same route is, what's his main influence when it comes to Christianity? It's medievalism.
Yeah.
And so I think that, like, isn't there a book, The Medieval Worldview, you were reading Lewis's Medieval Worldview?
Discarded Image is about...
there's a newer title, and it's C.S. Lewis in the Medieval World or something.
I think that's
like
the Medieval Mind or whatever.
Yeah, the Medieval Mind. That was
and so, again, though, that would make sense
I think he talks about that, too, in the Discarded Image.
Okay.
Where he very much so favored the theological and artistic sways of the Middle Ages.
And I think, so on the theological route, The obvious one that most people know about is the last battle of Narnia. And so there's these two sides. There's the Calormans and there's the Telmarines. Is that the others? The good guys? Who are the good guys?
That sounds right. Let's
Okay.
go with it.
We'll go with the good guys and the bad guys.
The good guys and the bad guys.
The good guys fight for Aslan, and the bad guys fight for a demon called Tash, or Tash, Tash. And so there's a Calorman who's on that side at the very end of the book. Sorry, reader, you're going to get a spoiler here. And the Calorman is at the gate of Narnia, and he's totally freaked out because he sees Aslan, and he realizes his entire life he spent worshiping Tash and serving Tash with all his heart, all his soul, all his mind, and now he sees Aslan, and he's like, oh no. And so he's really nervous, but then what Aslan does is he says, you did not know me, but you served like with all your heart, and so whatever you worship, you gave to Tash, I count to me. Enter now, true Narnia, my servant. And so that is a form of Christian inclusivism. And it's a very Catholic position. Yeah. So the Catholics are saying, the post-Vatican II documents say that if a person's never heard of Christ, but the light that they have, they live according to it, God will accept them into heaven. And so that's a huge problem with Lewis. And if he hadn't written The Last Battle, I don't know if we would have known that. But that also goes in line with the problem with Mere Christianity. So Mere Christianity is a book about defending basic Christianity, and he doesn't want to get into denominational specifics. And so he uses this illustration of a house. And so in the house are different rooms, and one room is like the sitting room, and that's like, say, Methodism. And then like the next room is like a dining hall, and that's like Anglicanism.
Well,
I
feel like that'd be the Baptist.
Yeah, that would be the Baptist. Yeah,
the dining hall.
You're horrendous.
That was perfect right now, Charlie. That was just so perfect. So then, and
certainly not the bar.
Well, okay, that's the Presbyterians.
Yeah.
And so, this is okay. But the listener, the point is, it doesn't really matter what the rooms are.
What about the hot tub?
All the Bethel Church. That I'm sorry. So there's all these different rooms, and his point is that
the hot tub's outside the house on the porch.
Actually, yeah. Well, no, they can't be in the porch. You'll see why in a moment. So
we can't mention who's in that hot tub.
Every analogy falls apart after a while.
The point is that once you go in the house, there's a room you're going to go live in, and he says, I don't really care which room you get. My point is not to get you into one specific room. He's like, I just want you into the porch, the entryway, because once you're in the entryway, you're technically in the home. But he doesn't care which room you go into. The problem is that he equates all denominations as equal, including the Catholic Church, which he has to, otherwise Tolkien, his buddy, would be totally offended. But by the end of his life, like you pointed out with the sacraments, he's leaning into Catholic, which is very Anglican, by the way.
What I mean when I said, I don't know if I actually said that on air or not. It might have been just like a side comment. But he at the end of his life is very devout in the taking of the sacraments, and you could I don't know if he ever comments on it personally, but even this is where I should have brushed up on this, but I think that he would even like want people to bring it to him.
Yes. Yep.
Like when he was ill and couldn't go to the church, like he would want people to bring him the sacraments. And you should think, like, why was that such a big deal for him? And is it like, in our view, like the fellowship of the church and, you know, like he wants to remember, or is it like, I'm missing something that I should be getting here? You know, like I want to make sure I'm secure, like that type of which would be very present in mainstream denominations with the sacraments.
And the other thing, maybe just a quick history tidbit, listener. The Anglican Church is the Catholic Church in England, but Henry VIII wants a divorce and wants to quit paying money to the Vatican that he's not getting any return on. So he forms his own church, calls it the Church of England. That's why it's the Anglican Church. And essentially it's just Roman Catholic. But during the Reformation, differing, like Henry VIII's son comes to power and he leans Protestant because his tutors have been very Protestant. So he pushes the church in a Protestant direction. They get rid of the kneelers, the icons, the candles. But then he dies and another half-sister, Mary, comes to the throne. And why does she get the name Bloody Mary? Because she kills like 3,000 Protestants, and she brings it all back to Catholic.
And this, when you say Protestant, you're talking like the Huguenots here, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about like the Reformation.
Probably we would say Huguenots, but
yeah, Huguenots. Yeah, Huguenots. Those would be Protestants. You'd have the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Reformed Church in France, and in Geneva, the Presbyterians up in Scotland, I believe, with John Knox. All of that would be Protestantism, and that would be like the five solas. But you're still getting some baby baptizing and whatnot. That was part of the things they fought over. But when Queen Mary comes to power in England, you have to understand that the monarch in England is the head of the Anglican Church. And so she's got to figure out a way to hold her church together. So what she does doctrinally is she says, look, individual Anglican churches, you guys can run it more Protestant or more Catholic. I don't care as long as you support me. So historically, the Anglican Church has sort of had one foot in Rome and one foot in the Reformation, and it's very accommodating. So when Lewis at times talks almost like a Protestant and then later talks like a Catholic, that's very Anglican. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's, like you're saying, that's one of the cautions for our listeners is you're going to get that. And in Screwtape Letters, purgatory comes up like 3 times at least.
And you want to be intellectually fair to not read your ideas into what he's saying. And I think it's really easy to do that with Lewis.
Yep.
Because you love what he's written, you love one of his stories, you love one of his books, you want to see him in the best light possible, which is actually virtuous. Mm-hmm. Love hopes all things. The reality is if you had a confessional statement from him, and we're obviously speaking from within a doctrinal system at Faith, we would have multiple doctrinal differences. Mm-hmm. Probably the biggest ones would be the inclusivism and the inerrancy issues. Mm-hmm. But there are others obviously sprinkled throughout there where he would definitely not agree with us on a lot of other things. But so just as always, you read with discernment.
Yep.
And you try not to read your ideas into someone. You try to understand what they're actually saying. Yeah.
I think another, well, I guess we're on the negatives. I have one more positive. I don't know if now's the right time to add it.
Do we have more negatives?
I have sacraments, purgatory, mere Christianity, and inclusivism written down.
Okay.
And then we talked about the inerrancy issue.
Yeah, and that's there's a lot you could find about that because there's differences of opinion of like how far was he away from like biblical inerrancy, like the Chicago Statement discussions and stuff like that. Like how far was he from that? And there's a lot of differences of opinion, but that gets into his whole like he and Tolkien of like is Genesis just another myth, but it's the true myth, and you know like how they would even begin to start interpreting some of the stories of the Old Testament. It's funny because we were off air talking about Jordan Peterson.
Yeah. And, I wondered if that was, and I going to save that or bring that up.
Well, I just get the sense that Peterson would probably interpret a lot of the Old Testament in a similar way that Lewis would.
Yep.
He's not taking it at face value. He's not looking at it from an authorial intent standpoint of like, you know, this is a real author communicating to real recipients and there's practical application. A lot of it's going to be a myth. It's going to be a principle. It's going to be like, what's the hidden meaning behind the story? And I can't say that definitively of Jordan Peterson. I've just heard a few clips of him talking about some things, and but I would get the sense that kind of the sounds really good from a philosophical, logical standpoint, might even be right in the realm of practical wisdom. But how he gets there from his interpretation of a passage is horrendous.
It is. Yep.
And so I feel like that would be a really good modern equivalent theologically to Lewis. And I don't know how you'd compare them in cross-section, but very intelligent, a worldview that you even maybe like and trust.
Yeah.
But when it comes to interpreting scripture, you're like, I don't know.
I'd almost say like, so in broad evangelicalism today, another name that comes to mind in our conversation, but I'll clarify why it's not, is, you know, good old Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So I think people love him because he says a couple of things that resonate. But when you look very closely at Bonhoeffer, it becomes clear he's probably not a Christian, or he's just a Christian existentialist, like a neo-Orthodox guy like Paul Tillich, perhaps, or Rudolf Bultmann. But I would say that like Peterson's not making any bones about being a Christian. Like he says he's not. He says he's drawn to it. And in that sense, I think that's why he's much more helpful than someone like Bonhoeffer. Whereas like Lewis, I think he actually is a Christian.
Yeah. He's
just got problems. So I definitely put Lewis here, but I would put Peterson in that neighborhood because of what you said. He's critiquing in like a reality way many times, but then I'm not going to him as my feeder source for scriptural input.
Yeah, it's like you can't, don't try to find more meaning in Lewis than what is in there.
That's good advice. I like that.
Like, can he really help you cultivate your mind and your affections in certain ways? Absolutely. But when he starts talking about, if or rarely he starts talking about scripture, you start trying to connect the dots.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's not perfect.
Yeah, he's not always wrong, but he's definitely not perfect.
I think he'd fall into the category. He has a lot of great conclusions, but the way he got there, especially like
scriptural,
he's not. A lot of times he's not arguing scripturally, and if he was, you'd probably not agree with the way he got there. Any other thoughts?
I would say.
What's your last positive? Did you already say that?
No, I'll say it right now. I've got two, and this might even be. So a final question, perhaps we could bat around, and then I'll give you my positive within it.
I do need to go rather
that's
soon
right.
here.
Why has he had such a big impact and such a long-lasting effect? And I think it would come down to my last positive I forgot to mention. He's really good with creativity. He uses creativity well, and so a lot of what he is known for is creative thinking. Like even Screw Tape Letters, it is fiction, but it's meant to address an issue, temptation. Pilgrim's Regress, it is fiction, but it's meant to address the Christian life. Narnia, Space Trilogy, a lot of the stuff he writes is creative, but it's deep. And I think that's where Peterson and Smith and so many others have drawn help. So I would just use this to listener, if you like to write stuff or you're creative, don't like brush that off like it doesn't matter. You can actually use that for good. And it can actually be something that can serve the Lord well. So I think that's part of like my last final good I would say is he was creative. And I think that was part of his long-term effect.
Yeah. You got anything?
Nope.
I unmuted just to say nope.
Nope. All right. Well, hopefully giving you some things to think about. Maybe you have some things you want to study some more. And maybe we've convinced you not to read Lewis. Then maybe you should just skip like the next month of podcast because we're going to read through the Four Loves and we're going to talk about it. Obviously, we think the good far outweighs the bad with Lewis, and we've chosen he and his friends' paradigm for learning and growing to apply to ourselves. That's why we get together.
We're gonna apply it to the Word too, and we're not going to just agree with him on every single point either.
We try to. We'll try to fill some gaps in maybe and build a theology of the loves that he's maybe just logically thinking through.
And I would say that probably what we've been trying to accomplish in this episode is to ourselves be Bereans. And perhaps that's something you can take away. So we really do like Lewis, but we do want to analyze and question him from like a God's word standpoint. And so I would just say that whatever you're doing in life, whatever you find interesting, remember to go back to the Word and consider it in light of the truth of the Bible.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Thinklings podcast. We would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback, suggestions, or potential topics that you'd like us to discuss, you can contact us through our email, thinklingspodcast@gmail.com. Remember, don't let this conversation end with this podcast. Read good books, talk about them with your friends, and always continue to cultivate your mind. See you next time on the Thinklings podcast.